In 2025, Star Wars fans are defending Jar Jar Binks, sincerely, in comment sections, making genuine arguments that the franchise's most publicly humiliated creation is more goated than anything Disney has produced across an entire decade of films and television. The striking detail isn't that anyone is making the argument. Almost nobody is winning one against it. He arrived in The Phantom Menace in 1999 and absorbed the most sustained critical punishment any character in franchise history had taken. His exaggerated accent, his physical slapstick, his capacity to derail the tone of every scene he entered, all of it landed as immediate, severe rejection from critics and fans alike. Ahmed, who provided his voice and motion capture performance, spent nearly 2 decades processing the psychological toll of that reception before the franchise began to reckon with what had been done to him. For 20 years, dropping his name in any Star Wars argument was a rhetorical kill shot. Say Jar Jar and you'd named the floor, the franchise's absolute bottom, the settled answer to what Star Wars at its worst looked like. Disney acquired Lucasfilm in October 2012, produced an entire decade of Star Wars content, and Jar Jar Binks started winning the comparison. This rehabilitation is a strict recalibration forced by evidence, not the product of nostalgia softening old wounds. Put Jar Jar next to the characters Disney produced across 10 years of sequel films, spin-offs, and streaming series, and the franchise's settled embarrassment reveals qualities the new characters don't have: internal logic, thematic function, a reason to exist within the story's architecture beyond serving as a vehicle for the thesis being made through him. Disney Star Wars characters fail, not because of fan toxicity or culture war backlash, but because ideologically driven writing systematically eliminates the structural ingredients that make characters worth caring about. And the proof is that a CGI alien from 1999 has outlasted every protagonist they've created. George Lucas, studying many tales in order to write the second draft of Star Wars, discovered that he had similar settings and characters to those mentioned in Campbell's The Hero with 1,000 Faces, a correspondence that mapped directly onto what he'd been developing independently. That correspondence produced characters whose internal architecture was durable enough to survive 45 years of rewatches, expanded universe spin-offs, and the particular intensity of affection that develops when fictional people become the emotional furniture of real childhoods. Luke Skywalker works in the 1977 film because the audience watches him fail before they're asked to believe he can succeed. His suffocating existence on Tatooine, managing moisture harvests under a guardian uncle who has learned to quietly contain a young man's ambitions, isn't padding between action sequences. Every subsequent claim the story makes about Luke's potential rests on the visible, specific weight of what he started from. When he fires the shot that destroys the Death Star, the audience has spent 2 hours earning the right to feel that moment alongside him. Han Solo works because his stated philosophy, that commitment is weakness, that the rational position is always the one keeping you free to run, gets challenged at real, visible cost across 3 films. His cynicism is placed under sustained pressure, and he pays for his return into something that matters because the story builds toward that cost deliberately across 3 films. In screenwriting, a flaw arc describes the protagonist's specific wrong belief that the story is constructed to test and ultimately transform. A character's conscious want drives what they pursue on screen. Their unconscious need is what the story quietly delivers beneath the surface. Luke wants escape from Tatooine and the larger life it prevents him from becoming. He needs to believe his father is still reachable. Those 2 drives exist in productive tension across all 3 original films, and the resolution of Return of the Jedi lands as the emotional event it does because both were taken seriously by the writing. Jar Jar Binks, at the absolute bottom of Lucas's creative ledger, still had a version of this architecture. Not as a flaw arc protagonist, he was comic relief, and aggressively broad comic relief at that, but as a functional piece of the story's larger machinery. His well-meaning political naivety was the instrument through which Palpatine's emergency powers became democratically legitimate. A Gungan senator, genuinely motivated by concern for the Republic, sponsored the motion that handed a future authoritarian the constitutional mechanism for his own empire. That's a specific purposeful idea about how democracies erode through the good intentions of people who can't see what's being assembled around them. Executed imperfectly, architecturally present. The Darth Jar Jar theory, the fan-constructed reading that Jar Jar was always a Sith Lord manipulating galactic events from behind a performance of incompetence, spread widely. Ahmed Best has remained diplomatically ambiguous on the question for years. What matters for this argument is that the theory's viral spread was itself a cultural event. Fans were retroactively searching for depth in a character they'd spent 20 years mocking. The cultural accounting had started shifting before the theory arrived to give it language. Disney's characters accelerated that shift by offering no competition. A character with thematic function, however imperfectly executed, has a reason to exist within the story it inhabits. Disney's flagship characters repeatedly didn't. That distinction was invisible when Jar Jar was simply the franchise's embarrassment. Disney made it legible by building characters who lacked even the imperfect version. The Force Awakens opened on December 18, 2015, and the goodwill it generated was real and enormous. J.J. Abrams understood franchise emotional circuitry with clinical precision. The Millennium Falcon banking through the corridors of a crashed Star Destroyer. John Williams' themes rising like inherited memory. Returning faces doing exactly what 4 decades of audience investment said they would. First viewings were euphoric. Second viewings are where structure becomes visible. The trilogy's inciting premise, Luke Skywalker in voluntary exile, withdrawn from the Force, unreachable, carries a logic problem embedded in its own plot mechanics. Luke left a map, a literal, fragmented, distributable map to his exact location, the recovery of which is the film's central MacGuffin and the engine of its chase narrative. Maps direct people toward destinations. Leaving one means you're directing someone toward you. Actively marking your location for discovery and being in hiding are mutually exclusive conditions, and the film never reconciles this because it doesn't acknowledge it. The entire trilogy's first act rests on this premise, so the crack runs through the foundation from day one. Rey's character presented a different structural failure, one the culture immediately misidentified. The criticism was labeled misogynist backlash to a female lead, and a formulation framing her detractors as hostile to her gender was deployed to end the craft argument before it could be articulated. The craft argument operates on gender-neutral structural ground and survives that dismissal intact. Within her introductory film, with no established training, no demonstrated history of costly failure, no visible struggle toward the abilities she suddenly exercises, Rey defeats a trained, force-sensitive opponent in extended lightsaber combat. She spontaneously reverse engineers a Jedi mind technique when Kylo Ren attempts to probe her mind, turning his interrogation back on him with no established instruction or precedent. She receives the saga's most iconic weapon as the story's confirmation of her central position, before the story has constructed a position for her to occupy. Audiences were pressed to accept her immediately as the story's center, and the resentment that followed stemmed entirely from these structural failures rather than demographic hostility. Her abilities didn't exceed a female protagonist's abilities. They exceeded what the narrative had built to support them. Competence without visible cost is wish fulfillment delivery. It entertains in the moment. It doesn't produce characters that outlast the moment of their creation. And it doesn't produce characters audiences grieve when the story ends. Luke faced Vader at Cloud City and lost his hand and his certainty about his father simultaneously, in the same few minutes. The costs the original trilogy extracted were the receipts needed to justify eventual credibility. The rise of Skywalker's revelation that Rey is a Palpatine heir wasn't a solution to her characterization problem. It was a public record of a writing process that had never decided who she was before centering her as the protagonist of a 9-film saga's conclusion. The Last Jedi arrived on December 15, 2017, and the rupture it caused hasn't finished moving through the cultural record. Rian Johnson brought a stated creative philosophy: Identify the most challenging, most subversive interpretation of each character and execute it, treating audience expectations as a resource to be deliberately undermined rather than honored. That approach has legitimate applications in certain artistic contexts. Applied to a franchise carrying 40 years of established character logic and emotional contracts made across generations of audience investment, it produced something the fandom spent years attempting to name with adequate precision. Johnson's name became the name for it. Rian Johnson style entered fan vocabulary as shorthand for a recognizable pattern. The creative choice that prioritizes surprise over psychological coherence. The confounding gesture over the action that flows logically from who a character has demonstrably been. Luke Skywalker's treatment in The Last Jedi is the emotional core of this entire case, the wound that hasn't closed in 8 years, and it requires the precision the grief demands. Return of the Jedi makes an irreversible statement about Luke Skywalker's psychology. At the saga's climax, confronting the Emperor, with Vader actively trying to bait him into rage, with everything he cared about hanging on the next 60 seconds, Luke set his lightsaber down. He refused to kill. That refusal represented a specific act of will rooted in a specific conviction. His father, the man who had tortured his friends and enforced a galactic empire's violence for decades, still contains something worth reaching for. Obi-Wan had told him Vader was gone. Yoda had confirmed it. Every rational reading of available evidence pointed the same direction. Luke refused the rational conclusion. He set down his weapon and staked the galaxy on a faith the universe had given him every reason to abandon. He was right. That moral architecture is the original trilogy's thesis, not a character beat, not a plot resolution, but the argument the entire structure was built to deliver. His refusal to kill is so central to what Luke Skywalker fundamentally is that it had no need of revision. Settled. Complete. Hold that against The Last Jedi's most contested scene. Sensing darkness in his sleeping nephew Ben Solo, Luke ignites his lightsaber over the boy's bed. Johnson dramatizes this as a momentary impulse immediately regretted. The regret is genuine within the scene's craft, the self-disgust performed with real skill. The question isn't whether the regret reads as authentic. The question is whether the impulse belongs to the same psychological person who set his lightsaber down against Darth Vader at the saga's most extreme moment. The man who chose principled faith under existential pressure, who refused violence when it was the most strategically defensible option available, by The Last Jedi's accounting, came within a heartbeat of murdering a sleeping teenage boy based on a vision. A version of that story earns the moment. It's a story in which the audience watches Luke's faith erode across witnessed, dramatized, costly events, in which visible psychological deterioration transforms the impulse from contradiction into tragedy. The Last Jedi provides a time jump and a brief flashback, and a character who presents himself as having arrived at resignation. The earned arc isn't there. The time jump stands in its place. Mark Hamill didn't conceal his reaction. He stated publicly that he had fundamentally disagreed with Johnson's interpretation, that the character he was being asked to play isn't my Luke Skywalker, that he initially considered the choice a mistake before moderating his language for the record. The initial statement remained on record, and it registered as more than professional disagreement. When the actor who inhabited a character across 40 years of his professional life tells you the established internal logic has been violated, that's a recognition, not a preference. Our hearts were broken after seeing him like that. That sentiment, recurring across comment sections in the years since, registers as genuine grief over a dismantled psychological architecture. There's a specific kind of loss attached to watching a character whose internal logic was built to mean something, have that logic taken apart for a more surprising story beat, and no amount of thematic justification quite reaches the level of that loss. The Holdo maneuver belongs to a different category of failure, less emotionally devastating, more architecturally irrevocable. Vice Admiral Holdo's hyperspace ram through Snoke's command ship is one of the most visually striking achievements in the Disney-era franchise. A silent white slash through deep space. Enemy vessels disintegrating in slow motion. The score dropped entirely, so the scale of destruction registers without competing aesthetics. As pure cinema, it achieves exactly what it reached for. As a contribution to the universe's internal logic, it retroactively asks a question every prior Star Wars battle can no longer cleanly answer. If a ship in hyperspace can annihilate an enemy fleet, demonstrated conclusively on screen, then the mathematics of one sacrificed ship ends the engagement were available to every military commander across the entire history of two warring galactic civilizations. At the Battle of Scarif, with rebel forces taking catastrophic losses and the Death Star plans seconds from recovery. Above Yavin, with the battle station 30 seconds from destroying the rebel base. At Hoth, across the entire Clone Wars theater. The option existed on every ship, in every hangar, in every engagement the saga had ever depicted. And apparently no commander across centuries of galactic conflict worked out the equation. Until one specific officer aboard one specific cruiser in 2017. Lucasfilm's subsequent canonical attempts to qualify the maneuver, that it required rare conditions, that Holdo's situation was uniquely aligned, were post hoc insertions written after the break was already visible to anyone who'd watched those earlier battles first. They stand next to the damage without repairing it. The Holdo maneuver is the clearest single example of a specific writing philosophy at work. The spectacular image purchased at the cost of the world's internal consistency. The striking visual elevated above the architectural logic required to support it. Kelly Marie Tran, who played Rose Tico, didn't deserve the harassment campaign that drove her off Instagram in 2018. The coordinated attacks that followed The Last Jedi were sustained, targeted cruelty, and her subsequent writing about the experience was among the most painfully direct public accounts of what that kind of campaign actually costs a person. While Rose was a badly written character, her actress deserved none of the hate directed at her. Stating that plainly is simply accurate. The structural failure of Rose's arc belongs entirely to the writers who built it. Her subplot with Finn on Canto Bight runs parallel to the main film's narrative stakes, rather than through them. A self-contained detour whose conclusion, the kiss that ends their sequence, actively undercuts the emotional trajectory Finn's character had been building toward. Writing failed Rose Tico. Harassment failed Kelly Marie Tran. Conflating those two claims has been the primary mechanism for dismissing the craft argument entirely, and the dismissal has always been more useful to the people making it than honest. The Book of Boba Fett premiered on Disney Plus in December 2021 and completed a different category of failure, one that extends the pattern well beyond the sequel trilogy. When Boba Fett appeared in The Mandalorian Season 2, battle-worn, deliberate, recovering his armor with the focused economy of a man who had crawled out of a sarlacc pit and returned to a galaxy that remembered exactly what he was. The fan response was immediate and electric. His mythology had been accumulating for decades across the original trilogy. The bounty hunter so dangerous that Darth Vader had to specifically instruct him not to disintegrate his targets. His sparse appearances across 3 films had generated a character the fandom had been filling in ever since, and every frame had earned the mystique it produced. His own series should have paid off 40 years of accumulated myth. The Book of Boba Fett instead presented a character who wanted to build a community. The show sent him back to his Tusken Raider captors in extended flashback, where he learned their customs, earned their respect, and was adopted as one of their own. A legitimately interesting premise for a character who wasn't Boba Fett. Another episode positioned him as a reluctant political leader in Mos Espa, calling meetings with the local crime families, appealing to mutual benefit, explicitly refusing to rule through fear. He rode a rancor as a pet, and spent episode after episode attempting to consolidate political power through negotiation and displays of patience. The show gave him genuine emotional scenes, competently executed, inside a story about a transformed man seeking redemption through civic responsibility. None of that is Boba Fett. The specific quality that made him work across those original trilogy appearances, lethal, purposeful menace, the implication that everyone in the room understood exactly what he was capable of, was replaced wholesale with something the writers found more contemporary and relatable. Stripping a character of their defining trait in favor of accessibility doesn't make them approachable, it makes them unrecognizable. The distance between his appearance in The Mandalorian Season 2 and his own show was so vast the character appeared to have been recast without a casting notice. The galaxy's most feared bounty hunter had become, in the fandom's precise and damning phrase, a pacifist vegetable. The Finn and Poe failures run parallel and deserve naming. The Force Awakens established one of the more genuinely compelling character premises in recent blockbuster history. A stormtrooper whose first-hand experience of state-sponsored violence broke his conditioning, who defected at personal cost, who arrived in the story with an ideological transformation already underway. That's specific, emotionally rich, dramatically interesting material. By The Rise of Skywalker, he was mostly running across landscapes shouting names, his earlier premise quietly shelved. Poe Dameron's regression in The Last Jedi operated differently, but arrived at the same destination. His established competence was temporarily suspended to make Admiral Holdo's operational secrecy appear retroactively justified, producing a version of his character whose decision-making couldn't be squared with who the first film had introduced. Kylo Ren warrants an honest distinction, because the argument requires one. His arc partially works, and acknowledging that matters. Disney produced characters that functioned to varying degrees, and credibility demands the accounting be honest. Kylo functions intermittently because he has a genuine flaw arc, the conflicted heir to both legacies, seduced by the dark side's promise of release from the crushing pressure of expectation. That conflict performed in scenes that cost both him and the audience something. The character's execution in The Rise of Skywalker was compressed past the point of credibility, but the underlying architecture was sound. That soundness stands out precisely because it's rare in this era's output. The Mandalorian makes the same point from the opposite direction. Din Djarin works because his progression from bounty hunter to reluctant guardian is staged through visible, costly transitions, each step requiring him to revise, on screen, what he has told both himself and the audience he values. Grogu works because the emotional stakes of their relationship are established through accumulated screen time before the audience is asked to feel them at full force. Both follow the same basic blueprint the original trilogy used, without apology. Applying that blueprint with discipline is the part that proved difficult elsewhere. George Lucas, describing what Disney did with the franchise 13 years after the sale, offered the most economical possible summary. Disney took it over and they gave it their vision. That's what happens. The word vision carries considerable weight in that sentence, describing, in the measured language of someone who has made peace with something irreversible, a fundamental creative reorientation of a franchise built on mythological architecture. What replaced that architecture wasn't diverse casting or political allegory. The original trilogy was politically allegorical throughout its runtime. Its ensemble included a black smuggler and a princess who organized her own rescue. And neither observation diminishes a frame of it. What replaced it was a priority inversion. Thesis above character, message above story. The striking image and the subversive choice elevated above the internal consistency required to make either mean something beyond the moment of execution. That inversion is why comment sections in 2025 are making sincere cases for a CGI Gungan from 1999. Ahmed Best received his quiet restoration through his appearance as Kelleran Beck in The Mandalorian, a composed, capable Jedi who rescues young Grogu during Order 66. And the warmth of the fan reception surprised people who hadn't been tracking how significantly the cultural accounting had shifted in the years since The Phantom Menace. The fandom that spent 20 years designating him as the franchise's punchline watched his rehabilitation with something closer to relief than irony. Disney didn't produce characters that made fans forget what Jar Jar was. They produced characters that made fans forgive him by establishing a lower standard of comparison. The problem that larger budgets and more carefully managed representation can't address is that they did it by abandoning the single thing that made even Jar Jar's worst moments survivable across 26 years. Writing a character who existed to serve the story he was in, not the argument being made through him. Subscribe for more.